Every generation has had its challenges. There have been wars and environmental challenges and things like this for a very, very long time. So I think, like here's an example. The most recent data that we've got for most of these data sets is from 2023. So is 2023, and you look at the levels of depression and anxiety and self-harm and so on, pretty high. So was that time period really worse than March 2020 at the beginning of COVID? Was it really worse than at the height of the Great Recession when a lot of people were losing their homes and when jobs were extremely hard to find? Is that really worse than the early 90s in the height of the crime wave, or in the 80s when people were thinking that Russia was, or USSR at the time, was going to drop the bomb at any moment? Every generation has had its external challenges. And I think it's pretty hard to argue that, living in 2023 is really that much worse than any other era.
Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. Building on decades of professional experience, this podcast tackles neurobiology, modern attachment, and more in an honest way that's helpful in healing humans. Your session begins now with Dr. Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott.
Before we get started today, just want to do a quick shout out to remind you all of all kinds of fun ways to get involved and to build community. We have professional consultation groups available. We have a course that we do live Q&As periodically. It also has a peer reading group within it to learn with other folks. We have a book, of course, Secure Relating, Holding Your Own in an Insecure World. So there's lots of ways that we are working to support you and provide different ways to connect and to plug in. So visit us at therapistuncensored.com and look for the events and happenings page, and you'll get caught up with us.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. I'm Ann Kelly, and we're going to dive into a topic that I find really fascinating, and that is how generations seem to differ so much from one another. Or actually, do they differ? It always seems that today's young adults always seem different than the generation before. Have you ever found yourself saying, like, kids these days, or whatever happened to work ethics? And generations after generations have complained about the one before. And is it that we really are different from one another? Or do we just romanticize our past or have beliefs about the way things should continue from our generation to the next? Our guest today is Dr. Jean Twenge, and she is a psychology professor at the San Diego State University who has spent decades studying generational differences through data, not stereotypes. So her research spans 43 million people across multiple generations. And what she's found can challenge a lot of assumptions about these differences. So from her findings, she has written several very compelling books, including iGen, Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood. And then one of her more recent book, Generations, The Real Differences Between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and the Silence, and What They Mean for America's Future. Really compelling titles. And I really found the reading thought-provoking, I guess to say the least. So in our discussion today, Dr. Twenge reveals about how technology across generations isn't just changing what we do, it's fundamentally rewiring who we are as people. And we're not just talking about recent trends from the iPhone and the computer. We mean technology across time, across all the advances that we keep making. Here's what's fascinating. And we did talk a lot about the current generation, Gen Zs, and she is able to use data to help us understand that today's young adults aren't actually just being lazy or weak-willed when they struggle with traditional adult milestones like getting a driver's license or moving out of the home. Instead, what we're experiencing is what she calls a slower life trajectory, which is a byproduct of our increasingly individualistic, tech-driven world. So, the same forces that have made Gen Zs more tolerant of differences and more freedom focused, these really positive characteristics of them, has also contributed to the rising rates of depression and anxiety. So, it's not all good or all bad, but it is extremely complex. So, today we do explore how technology over all generations has shaped our self esteem, our drive, and ability to achieve, even our beliefs about our own intelligence. So, she really shows us how understanding these patterns can lead to more compassion between generations instead of judgments. If you've ever wondered, like, why your teenager seems so different from how you were at their age, or why young adults today face unique challenges, I think this conversation will give you the research backed answers you've been looking for. I'm hoping to dive back into her with her again later in the summer because she has another book coming out, and I think I have so much more to learn from her. All right, let's jump in. Hey, Dr. Twenge, I'm so glad you joined us today. Thank you so much for coming on our show.
Thanks for having me.
You've spent your entire career studying generational differences. And in 2023, you published a huge study and the outcome of it that kind of draws a little bit of a different view on and why we differ, how our generations differ. I know I grew up understanding, well, the baby boomers went through this experience, or some people did World War II. Why do we differ? What does your research show that some of the causes of the differences in the personality among our different generations?
I mean, that's the classic theory of generations, is that we're different because we experience different historical events at different times in our lives. So things like wars, pandemics, economic recessions, and that's kind of the classic. But if you really think about why it's different to live now compared to 200 years ago or 100 years ago or 50 years ago or even 20 years ago, it's not really events. The long-term and day-to-day impacts is it's usually technology. So not just smartphones and social media, but also things like better medical care, which leads to longer lives, faster transportation, easier access to information, labor-saving devices like washing machines and stoves and grocery stores and things like that have had a huge impact on how we live. And that's what tends to change attitudes and mental health and everything else.
Yeah, I think about even this idea of private property. My son likes to point out that our concept of private property is related a bit to technology. Like once we were hunters and gatherers, and somehow we started claiming our space.
Yeah, agriculture.
Agriculture. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, how have you seen, if we think about technology, is each generation then with the new advances kind of seeing similar growth spans? We just each new technology happens and then we all adjust, and that's how we kind of differ in terms of how we communicate, et cetera. Is it pretty steady over our lifespan or over the generational span?
Well, a lot of technological change is really accelerated. I think it at least feels to many people like things are changing faster. So, one example of that is the smartphone, which was introduced in 2007. And then, at least in the US, most people had one by the end of 2012. So, that's 5.5 years, the fastest adoption of any technology in human history. And the smartphone had direct impacts, particularly on younger adults. So, that Gen Z would be that generation. But it's not just the direct effects of technology, it's also some of its downstream effects. So things like individualism, more focus on the self and less on others. That tends to happen when you have more technology in a society. And also what's called the slow life strategy, taking longer to grow up and longer to grow old, tends to happen when people live longer lives, and that's through better medical care. So that tends to mean, say, children don't have as much freedom, that teens are less likely to get their driver's license or have a paid job or go out on dates, that young adults get married later and have children later and settle into careers later, that middle-aged people look and feel younger than their parents or grandparents did at the same age. Those are all rooted in one thing, which is that we live longer and that education takes longer to finish in a more technologically complex society.
I can see that it has many positive impacts and it can really make our generations, the differences struggle. I guess we struggle with understanding one another, don't we? Right? Well, there's lots of judgment between generations about work ethics and values, and those of us raising those kids that won't get their driver's license and tend to have the slower growth, we tend to get mad at them, right? Like, I have my driver's license at this age. And so understanding that difference could really help us understand one another and quit judging each other.
Yeah, exactly. And that was one of my biggest goals in this book, was to help us understand each other better and to really move away from this narrative of like, whose generations, which generation is at fault for this and who should we blame, and the finger pointing when, these are big cultural changes. We're all experiencing them. And it's really counterproductive and inaccurate to try to blame one generation or another when these changes are so pervasive. But yeah, the slow life strategy, I think, is very useful for understanding generational change in that way. So, say if you're a boomer or older and you're like, why are my kids or grandkids not married yet? Or why haven't they had kids yet? And I had 3 kids by the time I was their age. Well, it's not just your kids or grandkids. Those are big changes that have happened across the board.
But help us understand those changes based on your research. What are you seeing as the generational shifts that's led to that? Can you be more specific? Yes, we have the iPhones, we have these things, but why then are we finding committed relationships so much more rare than they used to be, it seems?
With that, I think there's a number of factors. One is those things are just pushed later, but there is the new movement more with, especially with Gen Z, is not just to push relationships later, to maybe not have them at all. And that's fairly recent. So, that's also rooted in individualism, that we don't all have to get married and we don't all have to follow a certain path. And there's some clear positives to it as well. But if it's rooted in, a pessimism and a idea that, it's not safe to, be in relationships, or I may have to compromise, then you kind of have to take it out a little bit more and question the utility of that belief.
One thing you noted in the book, which I, as a psychologist, certainly see, and as honestly as parents see, as things, technology helps things become easier. It gives us sometimes more leisure time. It makes things more convenient. Like, there's a way that we might predict that we have more freedoms to feel good. And yet, as your research points out, Generation Z has more anxiety and more depression than most of the generations before them. Is that accurate? At least from your study, the time period of your study.
Certainly, if there's tons of evidence showing that, for example, young adults and teens today are much more likely to be depressed and anxious, suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, self-harm. All of these things have increased. Just really, they've skyrocketed among those younger groups compared to, say, teens and young adults even just 15 years ago. The rates are much, much higher. So that begs the question of why. Well, that intersects exactly with smartphones becoming common, social media moving from optional to mandatory, Facebook buying Instagram, phones having front-facing cameras. Like, all of these things converged in the early 2010s, and that's exactly where we see these things changing.
That's where your research shows like a spike or a shift was
Yeah, there's an
2010.
elbow in the graph, is the way some people put it. So, just take clinical level depression, with DSM criteria, major depressive episode in the last year, one of the best, data sets that we've got for that national study of drug use and health. And if you look for both 12 to 17-year-olds and 18 to 25-year-olds, going back to about 2005, there's very little change between 2005 and about 2011. It's flat. And then it just skyrockets upward. And that data set doesn't go back as far as we'd like, but there's some of teens, like Monitoring the Future, where they measure depressive symptoms back to 1991. And there's some ups and downs, but it really doesn't change a whole lot between 1991 and 2011. Long time period for not a whole lot of change. And then again, it goes straight up.
So say more about what that your study kind of finds, what you attribute to. Why would a smartphone? And I think parents out there or that age group really struggling to get out there in the world, a lot of times we describe it as It's just harder. We have more awareness of global warming. We have more conflict. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of reasons in the external world for kids to be more depressed. And that's not exactly what you're pointing to in your book.
No, and I would push back against that narrative to say every generation has had its challenges. There have been wars and environmental challenges and things like this for a very, very long time. So I think, I mean, like here's an example. The most recent data that we've got from most of these data sets is from 2023. So is 2023, and you look at the levels of depression and anxiety and self-harm and so on, pretty high. So was that time period really worse than March 2020 at the beginning of COVID? Was it really worse than at the height of the Great Recession when a lot of people were losing their homes and when jobs were extremely hard to find? Is that really worse than the early 90s in the height of the crime wave, or in the 80s when people were thinking that Russia was, or USSR at the time, was going to drop the bomb at any moment? Every generation has had its external challenges. And I think it's pretty hard to argue that, living in 2023 is really that much worse than any other era.
If it's not, then what do you attribute then? Why is the technological advances of the smartphone making such a huge and profound difference?
It's not just external stuff. It's not these historical events and the things that go on that often, are distressing, but they usually, and there's exceptions, but usually these are not things that are having an impact on people's day-to-day lives. Like the COVID pandemic being at the beginning, especially the biggest exception to that. But all of these other things generally don't have a big impact on the way people spend their time. The smartphone and social media do. They completely changed the way teens and young adults spent their time outside of work and school. So it used to be, just to take teens for an example, at high school age, that they would spend their time outside of school when they weren't doing homework or weren't at a paid job. They'd be hanging out with their friends and talking to their family for the most part. That's what they'd be doing. And then that really, really started to change. That teens started to spend a lot less time going out with their friends. They also started to spend less time sleeping. Right around that time, the elbow in the graph for sleep deprivation, same exact time. So you put this formula together: more time online and with screens, less time sleeping, less time interacting with friends face to face. That is a terrible formula for mental health.
Hey, all, I love this sponsor, Peak Nandaka. I know I'm not alone in falling into mid morning slumps, and then I would drink caffeine as a fix to pick me up, but it would give me the jitters or I'd have the drops. And when I switched to Peaks Nandaka, it is amazing. It's made with functional mushrooms. However, it's a 20-time extract of medicinal mushrooms. So, unlike some of the other mushroom coffees out there on the market that use grains and fillers and mycelium, this is a potent mushroom extract, and it also has ceremonial grade cacao and other things that make it taste great as well as support your metabolism. It reduces my sugar cravings and hunger pains. But what I really love is that it keeps me focused and energized all day long. I seriously love the effect. When I run out, I actually find myself tracking the delivery because I love how productive I feel when I drink it. So it's packed with prebiotic and probiotics, so it makes the digestion smooth. And like I said, the 30% cacao butter helps it absorb. So if you try it, I really think you're going to love it. So you can get 20% off plus a free starter kit. You're going to get a cup and a frother with it with your order. And when you shop exclusively at peaklife.com/TU, that's PIQUE life.com/TU, you'll get 20% off. Really proud of our new sponsor, Branch Basics. It's a women-owned company. They're from Texas. But what I'm really proud of is that they can make our home and our environment much safer. Have you ever wondered what toxic chemical cocktails you're spraying around your home every day? I was. And when I dove into it, it's really changed everything. Those conventional cleaners, including those all purpose ones that we grew up with, are actually packed with chemicals linked to serious health problems, from respiratory problems, asthma, allergy, even hormone disruptions that can cause reproductive problems, developmental issues for children. You should check the research out on this. Branch Basic eliminates those toxins while it actually works. It's a truly human safe alternative. No dyes or fragrances. Fragrances are often harmful additives. It's really easy to use. It's one concentrated formula and it can replace every cleaner in your house. You just dilute it differently for every different purposes. And it's biodegradable, so no synthetic chemicals persisting in our waterways. Yay on that. I also love that they tackled packaging waste problems. You can reusable bottles in your starter kits. You can use either plastic or glass. And as someone passionate about health and our environment, I can genuinely say this company really aligns with it, what we love. So detox your home. Visit branchbasics.com to shop their premium starter kits and save 15% off with code TU at branchbasics.com. So it's 15% off your new Branch Basics premium starter kit at branchbasics.com. And remember, TU for 15% off. Your lungs and your hormones and your planet are all going to thank you. Hey everyone, I have some great news to share. Our partner, AG1, just launched their next generation. So, in the same single scoop, you now get more vitamins, minerals, and upgraded probiotics. And it's now backed by 4 human clinical trials. So, in fact, AG1's next generation is now one of the most clinically backed greens powder. They went above and beyond the industry standard in testing and have made a great product actually even better. We frequently speak on the podcast about how important gut health is to our moods, our overall energy. And it's so hard to know what to do about it. I hate taking pills, and finding the right regimen doesn't always sometimes seem like just daunting. But AG1 Next Generation is clinically shown to fill common nutrient gaps, even in healthy eaters, actually, and support gut health. So this helps me know that I'm doing something good for my health. I actually look forward to my afternoon drink. I still love the taste. It's a refreshing way to get my foundational nutritional supplements. So subscribe today to try the next generation of AG1. If you use our link, you'll also get a free bottle of AG D3K2 and AG1 welcome kit, as well as 5 upgraded travel packs with your first order. So make sure to check out drinkag1.com/therapist uncensored to get started with AG1's next generation. And notice the benefits for yourself. That's drinkag1.com/therapist uncensored. You mentioned this in the book. I mean, I really highly recommend people to read the book because I got to read about my generation and kind of following through some of the assumptions and the things that really stood out in the personality of our lifetime. And you even mentioned in there that when you were born can impact your personality more than to whom you were born, which is as a psychologist, which is a really powerful thing you're talking about. And Sue and I love to talk about how much systems and context impacts how we engage in the world. And that's what I'm hearing you talk about. I digress. Going back to the phone, the other impact, you mentioned social media, is that we used to have to watch evening news. We used to have to grab a newspaper. Now individuals sit and they're bombarded with news, not only very rarely actually from down the street now, it's all from across the world or across the city. And that overwhelming piece of information constantly coming at us has to be impacting our psychological health.
So I think that's in there definitely as an influence, so that it's not the news itself, and that the news itself was always bad, and every generation at every time in one way or another. It's how we're exposed to it and how constantly we're exposed to it. I do think that is in there as an influence. However, because I first started seeing these trends among teens, most of whom are not paying a ton of attention to the news, I do think the things that are happening in terms of how they're spending their time day to day, they're not spending as much time sleeping or with their friends, has a bigger impact.
Oh, interesting. So is any of your study reflecting how aware each generation at that time period is aware of the news?
I mean, there's questions about how much they pay attention to that, and how much they're interested in government and affairs, and when I looked at that for iGen, which was published in 2017, it was not any higher. In fact, it probably was a little lower than when the survey started in the 1970s. I think it has come back in the last few years in terms of the awareness that teens have around news, but most studies of teens suggest that that's not the primary thing that they're doing with their time online. They're communicating with their friends, and then it's entertainment of short videos and influencer content and things like that. For most teens, it's not politics.
So it seems kind of circular, right? If we believe, which I guess is part of what you were saying is so important about this book, is to increase understanding and awareness. And if we believe that, of course, people are depressed and anxious because the world's so hard, there may be this experience then it's hard to go in and restrict the phone use and restrict these things, especially as you mentioned, social media is almost mandatory now in order to stay connected. I know I have the generation that appeared right as that started to happen. And you even were required to use your phone. While my children were in high school, there was a requirement in order to do your homework just about that you had a smartphone, or at least they claimed that. So if we don't necessarily conceptualize this as because they're upset about politics and global warming, but it is actually the relationship between that technology in and of itself, that could really change the way we look at how to manage that.
I think it has to. I think the other way to really capture why it's probably not concerns about global warming and news events and so on, where we see the biggest changes in mental health indicators? 10 to 14-year-old girls. You think about those age groups. For example, emergency room admissions for self-harm have quintupled among that group. So they have doubled for 15 to 19-year-olds, and then they've increased by, I think, somewhere around 50% for the next age group up. But the biggest changes are the youngest. And I think that also shows that, again, it's not these external events or the news or, everything is bad. It's day to day. Those kids are, instead of hanging out with friends, they're at 10 on TikTok and Instagram. And I think that's a huge, huge problem. So that's where I think we have to push back against schools saying, "Oh, you got to have a smartphone." I don't know. I have two kids in high school, and they have got by just fine without smartphones. Now they almost have to have a laptop, and so that's a whole other discussion. So this is the challenge that parents have. I have three teenage children, 18, 15, and 13. So this is my everyday life as well, that trying to protect them from some of these influences when they are required to have the laptop for school is a challenge. And in fact, that's my next book that's going to be coming out in September. It's called 10 Rules for Raising Kids in a High-Tech World, because this is what parents everywhere seem to be struggling with because it is so hard.
It's so hard, and I hope part of it is going to be an inclusion of how to deal with it socially, because it feels like such a common issue among social groups. Like if your child's the one that's not on social media, they don't get invited to that one event.
I have not found that to be true.
Really?
At least with my own kids and parents I talk to, that I
Yeah.
hear that a lot as
From
a
the
theory that, they
pressure
have to
at
be on social
times
media for that
to
reason.
not feel excluded, I guess is what
Yeah,
I'm saying.
there is
Yeah.
definitely pressure to be on it, and that's where their friends are, and there is that pressure, but it's not an absolute requirement. I mean, kids can communicate through group text. It doesn't have to be social media.
Point taken. And if we can stand in understanding the impact, but I hear parents say all the time, my child's addicted. And that used to just be, oh, yeah, I know we have to work with it. It's hit my alarm bell as actually they really are. You're not just saying that. Your child has a slot machine in their hand and they are addicted. And pushing against that protest seems like, from what you're saying and the findings from your research, would be something you're strongly recommending. Is that right?
Absolutely. You put off the smartphone as long as possible, put off social media as long as possible, because that is what happens too often is, especially the kids who start really young, then that's the only way they know how to live, and they become addicted to it, and it becomes a huge problem.
Are there any recommendations for parents or policymakers that, based on what you're finding, that you're strongly recommending right now?
So rule number 2 in the book is no phones in the bedroom overnight. That's for everybody, not just for kids. And if you say, I have to have my phone in my bedroom overnight because it's my alarm clock, buy an alarm clock. You can buy it on Amazon on your phone. Put your phone away, get a good night's sleep, get it out of the room physically. There's tons of research on this that you'll sleep better. For policy, there's a couple things. So no phones during the school day bell to bell is starting to really catch on, which is amazing and wonderful and should have happened a long time ago, but we'll take it happening now. Much better for learning, much better for kids communicating with each other face to face during the school day, like at lunch, for example, than it can be for face to face social interaction. And then if we can get any kind of policy around social media, which was not designed for children, it was not even designed for teens, of whether that's no social media until age 16 or requiring parental permission, or maybe if you have some verification of age that some of the more addictive features are not there when the user is, say, 13 years old versus being 25.
What really strikes me is that you've been studying for many generations. You've been studying for quite a while all of this information. And now is the time you're throwing an alarm bell, even though we've had technological changes over and over and over again. This is the first time in my reviewing all the ratings that you've been doing that you've now just stopped and said, this is the technological change we really need to pay attention to. Does that feel accurate to you?
In a way, I mean, I did a little bit of an alarm bell too with, especially in the 2000s, around the overemphasis on building up self-esteem without any basis. That seemed to be
Well, we
leading
would
to
agree with that.
narcissism. That was a little bit in that category as well. This is more serious though, because here we're talking about not just things that might cause some problems here and there, but are things like major depressive episode and suicidal thoughts and self-harm, where it's really crossed to a very, very serious level. And we have to try to stem the tide of this adolescent and young adult mental health crisis.
Thank you so much. And when your new book comes out, I really want you to hop back on and let's talk about some of the strategies that you've come up with. When is it?
September the 2nd, right after Labor Day.
Oh, good deal. The beginning of the school year. Well, let's jump on at the end of the summer and we'll talk about some of the strategies because I think it'd be very worthwhile. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. And hey, I'll see you next week, this end of this week.
That's right.
Psychotherapy Network.
That's right.
All right.
Awesome.
Take care. All right, you guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Please take the time to pass this on to anybody that might benefit from it, to rate and review us. Also, be sure to think about joining us. As she points out, we're trying to really stem the tide of disconnection. So we have the Vitality series that if you're interested in joining a group experience online where we are connecting and talking about how to keep our vitality, especially during this hard time, jump on to Therapists Uncensored, look at events, and you can sign up. They're monthly. All right. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you around the bend.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.